get started, let's talk about the 5 primary kinetic chains and the 5 principal actions that go along with each kinetic chain. We'll be referring to these kinetic chains and how they interact with each other throughout this discussion. The first kinetic chain is the intrinsic kinetic chain. That is related to our breath and nervous system. Our breathing apparatus has to be appropriately responsive to our movement, or else our movement is going to be impaired by our nervous system. This is the relationship of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. The second kinetic chain is the deep longitudinal. This is related to the strike phase of the gait, or how we're responding to the combination of kinetic energy, the body moving, gravity, and ground engagement. This creates a wave joint by joint up the body. If we're heel strikers, it's starting at the heel. If we're a forefoot striker, it's starting at the forefoot through the plantar aponeurosis to the heel, up to the knee, up to the hip, to the pelvis, to the sacrum, to the spine, and so on. The body responds to this with ground force reaction. Ground force reaction is based on the third kinetic chain, the lateral kinetic chain. This is the stability that we require in the axial skeleton, the frontal plane of the pelvis, so that we can push into the earth. These 3 kinetic chains create the dynamic platform. The dynamic platform provides the base so that our 4th chain, the posterior spiral, that's where the elastic energy is being coiled into our structure, into our fascia, into the fascial springs. That coiling is not realized until it's translated into the complementary opposite. In the walking gait, that is the swing phase. That's what gives us our, when the push turns into forward motion. It is that forward motion is the realization of the coiling of the push. Breath and nervous system, shock absorption, ground force reaction, our axial stability, coiling and uncoiling stored elastic energy. These are the 5 principal actions that we need for efficient and effective movement. The 5 primary kinetic chains are based on movement, kinesiology. The charts that are contained in the 5 primary kinetic chains are kinesiology charts. They're not functional anatomy charts. There's a slight difference in functional anatomy and kinesiology. Just as there's a difference between the depiction of fascial meridians or fascial trains and kinetic chains. The 5 primary kinetic chains are based off of Audrey Fleming's work in the 90s. Dr. Fleming postulated the main causes of lumbar dorsal pain, which was related to how these 5 subsystems all coordinate. If the subsystems can't coordinate together or individually, the body has to come up with a workaround. It has to come up with a way to keep it safe during movement. And that leads to aversion of movement and pain. So, what do we have here? We've got 5 chains. The first 3 chains are going to create what I call the dynamic platform. Now, the overall theme that we're looking at here is stored elastic energy. Fascia is a potential energy system. I use the word potential because it is our muscles and movement and kinetic energy, gravity, these elements that we encounter when we're moving, that is acting on the fascia, and the fascia is storing that energy so that it can release it. In order to do that, we have to have a platform to work off of. In the 5 primary kinetic chains, the first 3 chains, the intrinsic, the deep longitudinal, and the lateral, the red, the orange, and the green, they create this foundation that the structure needs so that it is safe to coil and uncoil. It is safe to generate potential energy so that we can act in our environment. There are not only the 5 primary kinetic chains, there's also a principal action that goes with each chain. The first chain, the intrinsic, the principal action is about how our breath and our nervous system integrate. When we start to look at movement, there are 3 main inputs that we have to have so that we can move efficiently and effectively. It starts with our visual cortex. We're taking in information through our foveal and peripheral vision. These inputs are very important. You'll notice if you look at the way that blind people move compared to seeing people, it is very, very different. The next important input is our vestibular system. I like to think of the vestibular system as the gyroscope of the body. The bones in the ear canal, the ossicles, they are responding to gravity, movement, to give our sense of where our body is in relationship to gravity. Our ability to do a single leg stance is related directly to our vestibular system. Now the vestibular system and the visual system are coupled. They call it the ocular vestibular response. This is part of the relationship of our eyes to the horizon. This is what allows us to walk and have our attention on any point in our environment. The third input is our proprioceptive feedback loop. This is all the neurological inputs that our body is sending the brain to interpret where we are in space, how our movement is evolving. Now there's 2 flavors here. There's the felt sense, meaning that we have a feeling about where our body is. We can sense pressure. We can touch the tip of our nose because we know where we are in space. There's also the non-felt sense. This is the information that connective tissue is relaying to the brain directly to the cerebellum. Ligaments are very important, I'm going to use the word neuromuscular switches, meaning when a ligament becomes stretched, the input volume goes up to the cerebellum. The cerebellum is responding to that stretch by inhibiting the muscles that would act on that ligament to stretch it more. This is how, in our walking gait, we do not have to think about the very complex action of muscles working in contralateral synergies, contralateral opposites, and so on. It happens on its own. We don't have to think about it. We just have to think about what we're trying to accomplish, where we're trying to go. I like to give the word the kinesthetic field, this non-felt sense, and the proprioceptive field is the felt sense. These are the three aspects that the nervous system is coordinating and integrating with how we're responding to our environment. How does this correlate with our breath? When our nervous system is overwhelmed by these inputs, our nervous system upregulates. It goes into a sympathetic mode, and our breath is following that. Conversely, when there is movement coping strategies within the breathing apparatus, and we stimulate those coping strategies by taking the inhalation in, holding our breath. There's many different kinds of strategies. That upregulation in turn affects how our muscular skeleton is going to respond. This is that relationship between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. The second kinetic chain, the deep longitudinal. This is about how our structure is responding to kinetic energy, shock absorption. When we engage in the ground, it sends a wave up, and our nervous system has to respond to that wave. The way that it's responding to that wave is through the lateral kinetic chains. It's pushing and reaching into that wave to equalize pressure. Now this is dynamic, meaning we need to have stability over a range of motion. It's not just in a static position. It's dynamic and moving. When we have faculty in all three of the kinetic chains that provide this platform, then we have the ability to start to look at storing and releasing elastic energy. What is storing and releasing elastic energy? If we think about a spring, a compression spring is coiled, and in its neutral state, it's in this extended position. When you put pressure on that coil, it compresses. That's why they call it a compression spring. You have a compression spring on your car. The front coil springs on your front struts, those are compression springs. When your car hits a bump, the spring compresses to absorb that energy in that bump. Now, there's a couple of different ways. There's another kind of spring that's called a expansion spring. And basically, it's a spring where the coils are closed, and when you put tension on the ends, the spring is loaded. If you release this tension, the spring comes back together. Just as on a compression spring, when you coil and compress, when you release those compressive forces, the spring back extends. Now, I call the spring system in the body fascial springs. Now, there are four main fascial springs. There's the lumbar dorsal fascia, the iliotibial band, the Achilles tendon, and the plantar aponeurosis. I call these the main fascial springs because every joint is a fascial spring. It's that these four particular fascial springs are the spring systems in the body that can generate the most energy. They have the most potential to store energy and the most potential to translate that energy into the complementary movement. Now there's something very specific that has to happen in order for these fascial springs to store and release elastic energy. And this is coordination and integration. If we think about the body as one big fascial body with many unique compartments. Each one of those compartments has a job. And those compartments all have to work in a synergy with each other. Now, how did that relate to integration? If we look at the kinetic chain charts, you see I have listed all the muscles that are acting as synergists together in a kinetic chain. If one or more of those muscle groups aren't doing their job participating in this symphony, somebody's going to have to take up the slack. Somebody's going to be overworked. It's like the idea of a baseball team. You have 9 players on the baseball team. If the shortstop has sprained his or her ankle, all of a sudden they're not able to play their position. All the other players are going to have to compensate for the shortstop not doing its job. Now, if we start looking at the potential of these fascial springs to act and to store elastic energy, all these functions of these compartments need to be able to respond dynamically in both concentric and eccentric action as they are working on these compartments. When we start looking at this idea of coiling and uncoiling, there's 2 things that are happening. One side, let's take a look at the deep longitudinal kinetic chain. This is the blue chain. We have a spiral that runs from contralateral shoulder through the lumbar dorsal fascia, through the pelvis to the iliotibial band, down through the compartments of the leg, into the Achilles tendon, and into the plantar aponeurosis. The coiling action is the activation of these muscles putting tension on the fascial springs. Tension. Something unique is happening though. In order for there to be one action, there's also a complementary opposite. The complementary opposite in the posterior spiral is the anterior spiral. Now here, in this picture, the anterior spiral is in concentric action. In this illustration, if you look at this side of the body is coiling, The opposite side has to be lengthening. That's where the elastic energy is being stored. In that stretch, in that action of lengthening the tissues, there are two complementary things that are happening. One is what's happening with the muscles. As muscles lengthen, they get to their endpoint. There's a function called the stretch receptor response. It acts like a rubber band. So then the muscles charged and ready to act in the opposite is gone from eccentric lengthening to concentric shortening. And at the same time, these fascial compartments are doing the same thing. As the fascial compartment is lengthening, it's ready to return to its normal state, and that's the release of the elastic energy. Now, if we look at these four fascial springs, the lumbar dorsal fascia, we'll start with. When we talk about core, that's the relationship of the breathing diaphragms and the breathing apparatus, the obliques, the hip flexors, the quadratus lumborum, everything that ties into the lumbar spine, all of those compartments are acting on the lumbar dorsal fascia spring. One important function is, if you think about the psoas being in the front of the spine and the quadratus lumborum being in the back of the spine. Actually, it's like this, the fibers. They share a fascial compartment, though they have a very different function. If one or the other loses its function, the fascial compartment then loses its vasoelasticity and starts to brace to protect the body from moving into a range of motion that it does not have the support or the dynamic stability required to respond to movement. So when the contralateral psoas and quadratus lumborum, they need to function in functional opposites. When they can't, the lumbar dorsal fascia cannot coil. And that means that it can't store elastic energy, and it doesn't have elastic energy to release into the complementary opposite. This becomes very important because when the fascial springs lose their capacity to store and release elastic energy, that means muscular compartments have to work harder to accomplish the same amount of work. This is related to efficiency. So there's a very simple way of looking at this. If we rotate the torso, right here, I'm sitting, so my pelvis is closed chain. If I rotate the torso, there's the spiral line of the anterior that is activated. This one is stretching. Concentric, eccentric. In the back of the body, it's opposite. What was the eccentric? This is the concentric side. And what was concentric is the eccentric side. This is called counter spiral when we walk. So we've got the pelvis rotating in one direction, which is coupled with the lumbar. At the lumbar thoracic junction, that coupling starts to switch. So now the thoracic spine is rotating in the opposite way. So here, the lumbar spine is rotating this way, but the thoracic spine is rotating in the opposite. And the same with the cervical coupling to the cervical thoracic. And it's rotating in opposite. Now, as I rotate, and I coil, the uncoiling brings me to the other side with less muscular activation. That's how this coiling and uncoiling is creating efficiency in the body. The next spring is the iliotibial band. The iliotibial band is often misunderstood. And that's because when we start thinking about the phase of the gait as we're moving from shift to push, the hip flexors need to have capacity in eccentric lengthening. If we think about the relationship of the tensor fascia lata and the gluteus maximus. The gluteus maximus is an external and hip extensor. The tensor fascia lata is an internal rotator and hip flexor. They're functional opposites. During the push phase of the gait, the gluteus maximus is the main coiling muscle. The gluteus maximus is the main coiling muscle as it's acting on the lumbar dorsal fascia and the lat, opposite the contralateral lat. That means that the tensor fascia lata is in eccentric action. It is the thigh is externally rotating and the hip is extending. That is what is going to be coiling on the iliotibial band. If the hip flexors do not have that capacity, the iliotibial band loses its capacity to store elastic energy, just like in the lumbar dorsal fascia. So, core has to be functioning well, all the muscles that tie into the lumbar dorsal fascia. Now, if you've ever had a lumbar strain where your multifidus is strained or the sacrospinalis muscle group, you can feel from tip of coccyx to the junction of the thoracic lumbar spine. It's all connected. When that occurs, we lose all the rotary coiling action on the lumbar dorsal fascia, and our gait is impaired. Our gait is impaired when our hip flexors lose eccentric stability as well. Now the next spring that brings us to is the Achilles tendon. Now the Achilles tendon is a very interesting fascial spring because the length of the tendon. Tendons are a kind of connective tissue. It's not a fascial compartment like the layers of the lumbar dorsal, because it's connecting muscle to bone through the periosteum. The relationship of how the gastrocs and the soleus are acting on the leg compartment is informing our ability to coil through our Achilles tendon. If we think about as the foot comes down, we're stretching the tendon. That's putting elastic energy into it during the stretch. When that tension is released, we have that spring action, like a bunny hop. That's what we're looking to have, that integration. And all the functions of how our toes are acting on our foot, how our foot is acting on our tarsals, how our tarsals are acting on our fibula and tibia, are all affecting how our Achilles tendon is able to store and release elastic energy. Now the last fascial spring seems to be the one where most people have the awareness that people have challenges there, because there's a generic diagnosis that goes around that's actually ill-informed, and that's plantar fasciitis. That's where the plantar fascia becomes inflamed because it's not effectively storing and releasing elastic energy, or more so the case, the other three fascial springs aren't able to do their job. And so the plantar fascia is overworked. We have to look at both as possibilities. And the way that you look at that is the function of how the metatarsals and how the phalanges are acting in concentric and eccentric action. This is all part of gait. And I go into this in great detail in the Gait Master Course. When we have this ability to have muscles coil on these fascial springs so that the fascial springs are then being stretched, it is that release of elastic energy that becomes the important part. Why is that? It comes back to energy potential. The potential of stored elastic energy is not realized until it's translated into the functional opposite, or the complementary movement. So, coming back to this counter rotation of the spine, I'm coiling elastic energy. But if I don't allow that energy to translate, if I move slow, if I give myself a little resistance so I'm not utilizing that stored elastic energy, that potential isn't occurring. If I coil and allow myself to uncoil and move back and forth with that, then I am experiencing that potential energy because I'm realizing the translation into the complementary opposite. And this is in the gait phase. This is when push becomes swing. So why is all this so very important? As therapists, when your clients come into your office, they're going to be talking about different challenges that they have. Perhaps those challenges are movement related. Perhaps those challenges are related to pain and discomfort. We know that pain creates aversion. Our body moves away from pain. We're not going to move into pain. When we start to have a template to look at the map of how the body is integrating, how all these individual components build together, how they join together, then we can start to look at the client is experiencing this particular symptom. The cause of that symptom usually isn't local. It's usually something remote. We have to have a template to start looking at these remote things. For example, let's come back down to the second fascial spring, the iliotibial band. A lot of people will talk about pain in their leg. People will experience pain in the knee, pain in the upper leg, pain in the quadriceps. And it will be accredited to, oh, you have a problem with the iliotibial band. Well, I'm going to say the problem isn't in the iliotibial band. The iliotibial band is the symptom. It's the symptom of not having these muscular compartments that are acting on the band so that the band can appropriately store and release elastic energy. When we restore those muscular compartments doing their job, guess what? All the fascia starts to perform again. Now, there's something that's unique about fascia that I'd like to talk about. There's some research about fascia having contractile capacity. Yes, it's very different than muscle capacity. Muscle has the capacity for fibers to move rapidly apart and together. Connective tissue doesn't. Connective tissue moves very slowly. If you've ever played with the cornstarch, where you take cornstarch and put it in a container, add water to that, push hard on the cornstarch and you get resistance. Be very soft and the cornstarch will start to move. Fascia is very similar that way. That's why it's used as one of the palpation tools to learn how to work with fascia. When the muscles that act on these fascial compartments cease to be normally responsive, cease to be doing their job, part of the job of the fascial system as a master communicator of the body is to protect the body. How does it do that? The fibers start to thicken and we lose elasticity. This is part of limiting movement because the movement is not safe. When we restore how the muscles are acting on those fascial compartments, it is then safe for the nervous system to restore the elasticity back in the fascia. Why is this important? Old school deep tissue therapies would strip tissues. They would get in and work on the body very aggressively. The safety mechanism of the body is holding rigidity in those tissues for a reason. It is a coping strategy to keep the body safe. More times than not, that coping strategy is based on not having this dynamic stability that I'm talking about of concentric, eccentric availability. You go and strip those tissues. You remove that coping strategy. Then the structure is vulnerable. Instead, we have to be smarter. We have to work smarter. We have to work with the nervous system. We have to be interactive with the nervous system by evaluating how the nervous system is responding to movement, how the tissues are responding to movement, what specifically those tissues need if they're not playing in the game, and if those tissues are overworked, they're overworked for a reason. Why are they overworked? What tissues are not playing that they're overworked for? This becomes a very, very different paradigm. And this perhaps is the most important aspect of how we progress our profession. Is instead of looking at who's overworked and let's just tone them down, who's overworked, who's not playing, we got to get the players that aren't participating back in the game. Then balance can be restored. Balance can't be restored if we go in and simply strip tight tissues. The nervous system is going to go, I needed that to cope with XYZ over here not working. I'm either going to reutilize that coping strategy, or I might not be able to, and I might get injured. And this is one of the reasons why we look at athletes and stretching. High-end athletes do not stretch before an event. Why? Because stretching creates a neurological response of inhibition. No, we want to excite those tissues so that they're available. We want to use percussion and compression on those tissues so that those tissues are woken up, so that they're available to respond, so that they're available to integrate into the skills of whatever activity they're participating in. And if that athlete goes and stretches, they may neurologically inhibit those tissues temporarily, and when they need those tissues to fire 100% on the moment, it's not available. There's a lot of different reasons why we need to look at fascia differently. I've gone over some of them. The biggest takeaway that I would like for you to have is one that I call integration. And that is, in order for fascia to perform, move, and respond optimally, the compartments of the musculature that act on those fascial compartments need to be responding in a dynamic way to a moving environment. When that occurs, the body has the potential to adapt and efficiently move. This starts to open up a whole nother conversation. And this is the conversation that I go into in the Gait Master course. This is about how there's individual building blocks of movement. Each joint has its potential of movement. Those building blocks of movement then start to combine into more and more sophisticated movement. If there's a missing building block, a movement that the brain doesn't recognize as available, the brain comes up with a workaround. That workaround is often known and referred to as compensation. From my perspective, compensation gets a bad rap. The reason why, I believe compensation is the hero. Compensation is there to keep us safe. because the nervous system is doing the very best it can, given that it does not have an available building block of movement. Our job as therapists is to discover what building blocks of movement aren't available and give that back to our clients so that they can effectively store and release elastic energy.